Hello, everybody, and welcome to Ice-Burgh To Go, your daily dose of Pittsburgh Penguins news and analysis. You can find us on YouTube at Inside the Penguins or anywhere you get your podcast from. Today, we're talking about a little bit of news that was shared yesterday by Rob Rossi of The Athletic about head coach Mike Sullivan and where he stands with the Pittsburgh Penguins. Many have speculated about Sullivan's standing with the Penguins organization, and well, it's easy to see why. Back-to-back missed postseasons and 6 years without a playoff series victory, that'll do that. That'll create some speculation. That'll create some buzz around Sullivan and how secure he should be in his position as head coach of the Penguins organization. Now, Rossi, like I mentioned, of The Athletic, cleared some things up for everybody yesterday in a piece where he addressed several of the Penguins' offseason storylines at this current point in time. And if you have The Athletic, I encourage you to go read that. There's a lot of good information, in that article outside of what he had to say about Mike Sullivan. But on Mike Sullivan, this is what Rossi had to say. For one, Sullivan was the Devils' preferred choice for their head coaching vacancy this offseason. Doesn't come as a surprise. We've heard rumblings about that from Elliot Friedman of 32 Thoughts, the podcast, that the Devils would like to have Mike Sullivan as their next head coach. And in fact, there was buzz for about a week that there could be a head coaching trade in the works. But at the end of the day, none of that ended up being a factor. None of that was of any substance simply because Mike Sullivan was never made available by the Pittsburgh Penguins. In fact, according to Rossi in that article yesterday, Dubas went as far as to reassure Sullivan of his position within the organization, saying, quote, "At some point during the end of season meetings with Dubas, Sullivan directly inquired about his job security. Sullivan exited that meeting with Dubas reassured that he was Dubas's long-term choice to coach the Penguins." How long-term exactly? Well, for starters, he's entering the beginning of a 3-year contract extension with the Penguins that has him with this team for the next 3 seasons. So that's a good place to start. Now, I will say, all this does for me is say for at least this summer, the speculation can stop. We don't have to come on here and talk about, are the Penguins satisfied with what Mike Sullivan has done? Are the Penguins happy with Mike Sullivan as their head coach? The answer is he's their head coach. That's been the answer for the majority of this offseason, but there's always been the caveat of, well, but at the same time, they haven't missed the playoffs in back-to-back seasons in a very long time, nearly 2 decades. They haven't won a playoff series since 2018. So it's fair to assume in a league where over half of the coaches have been turned over in the last calendar year that perhaps Mike Sullivan is not as secure as everybody believes. But this reassures us that, okay, that speculation can be put to an end and come to a close for the time being. Sullivan enters next season seemingly without his seat warmer on at all. He's not sitting on a hot seat, but that doesn't mean that it can't turn up, and it can't turn up quickly if the results don't change. The main question is going to be, how long before that happens? How long is the leash? Because there's no way it's as long as it used to be. I understand there is a connection between Mike Sullivan and Fenway Sports Group, but as we're coming to learn, there's a connection between Kyle Dubas and Fenway Sports Group that's pretty deep as well. But how patient is Fenway going to be? How patient is Dubas going to be? How patient are the Penguins going to be in general? Because if you look at the last couple of seasons, the Pens have gotten off to some slow starts, right? 2 years ago, they were 10-7-3, which, I guess is technically a winning record if you include the pity points, but they were 5th in the Metropolitan Division. Last season, they were 10-10-0 in their first 20 games, and they were 6th in the Metropolitan Division. Kyle Dubas mentioned on the first day that he was the Pittsburgh Penguins president of hockey operations that one of his biggest goals is getting this team to be able to compete within the division, because that is how you make the playoffs in today's NHL. Easiest way, be in the top 3 of your own division. Outside of that, you figure it out. But that is one of the top things that Dubas mentioned. And when the last 2 seasons, Sullivan has started behind the 8 ball in his own division, another start like that, I would have to imagine, would turn up the heat at least a little bit, right? Kyle Dubas was very patient with everybody last year. There were not very many moves made. He was not firing coaches. He was not firing assistant coaches. He wasn't even making trades to shake up the locker room. Now, he said after the season that he had tried. The market wasn't there. They couldn't come to an agreement that was mutually beneficial for the Penguins and the other team, or at least close enough to warrant pulling the trigger on any trades. But Kyle Dubas all season was, well, we'll give him to the All-Star break. And then at the All-Star break, he said, well, we're in kind of the similar situation. We'll give him a little bit more time before the trade deadline. And at the end of the day, it seemed to be too little too late. They made the moves at the deadline. It turned the ship around a little bit towards the end of the season, and they played some of their best hockey. But Dubas's patience didn't pan out last year. Is he going to be able to be patient again? If they start 10-10 for a second consecutive season, and they're in 6th place in the Metropolitan Division, and they're falling behind those top 3 spots and digging themselves a hole, is he going to continue to be patient, or is he going to turn the heat up on his head coach? That's going to be the biggest thing to monitor, because as of right now, there shouldn't be any speculation through the offseason, excuse me. That can probably cancel out the speculation of a Chris Knobloch situation this past year with the Edmonton Oilers, right? A Jay Woodcroft, Chris Knobloch situation, where if he goes 5-5 in the first 10, he's fired simply because they can't afford to continue to follow the 8 ball. I think he'll have a little bit more leeway than that. But once you get to that 20-game mark, that quarter of the season mark, if the Penguins are still floundering in the same position that they are, obviously this is contingent upon who they're able to bring in, what the team looks like going into the season. But if they're in that same position, how patient can Kyle Dubas be, knowing that the timeline is very reduced here for the end of Crosby, Malkin, and Letang's career? The goal, as stated by Dubas and many others within the organization, is to bring another cup to the Penguins organization before those three call it a career. So how patient will he be? That's the biggest question to me going into next season. But it's a question that we won't get an answer to until mid-November at the earliest. But the last thing I want to touch on here with Mike Sullivan is a sentiment that I've seen, and I've honestly shared at certain points over the last season, that Mike Sullivan's message has gone stale. And I say that, I had that belief at some points during the season simply because it's what you think whenever you see the team playing, especially the way they did around the trade deadline. You look and say, this team just looks like they're not playing for anything. And that falls on coaching. It falls on a lot of things, but the majority of it falls on coaching. And I said, you know what? The message does seem to potentially be getting stale. And then you take a look at it a little bit closer. And that's why I think I'm changing my tune a little bit here, because it's stale to who exactly? That's what I am starting to have some trouble with. Who is Mike Sullivan's message stale to? He's been the Penguins head coach since December of 2015. So yeah, he's been here for 8 years at this point. Potentially, the message could go stale with people that have been here for 8 years and playing under him for 8 years. But the list of players that have played for him, let's not even say for 8 years, the list of players that have played for him since the 2022 playoffs is down to 7. That's 2 years. 7 players have been consistent through the past 2 seasons. And there can be a completely different discussion on whether that is good or bad for the Pittsburgh Penguins, because you're probably going to see a little bit more turnover this offseason as well. But 7 players, Crosby, Malkin, Letang, Pettersson, Rust, Raquel, and Jari. Those are the only players left from the 2022 playoff series against the New York Rangers. The last time the Penguins were in the playoffs. 7 out of 23 that you can play on an active roster. 7. There's nobody in the minors. There's no young guy that was up as a black ace and played in one game and just isn't around anymore or is still in the minors. 7 players. And 3 of those players, the big 3, Crosby, Malkin, and Letang, have stated on multiple occasions, have been quoted on multiple occasions that they want Mike Sullivan to be their head coach. So who is the message stale for? Rickard Rakell? Brian Rust? Marcus Pettersson? I mean, first of all, personality-wise, I don't see Marcus Pettersson being somebody that would get into that frame of mind. Same goes for a guy like Brian Rust. I don't know as much about Rickard Rakell. He doesn't speak as often to the media as those other 2 do. And is the message stale for Tristan Jarry? Is it really? Like, what does that do for a goaltender? What is Mike Sullivan's message of just play? That's been his moniker for a while. What does that do for a goaltender? So that's where I have an issue with his message is stale crew. I understand where you're coming from completely, wholeheartedly. I agreed to a certain point. But when you look at it deeper and I see there's only 7 players and the rest of it's all new players coming into play for Sullivan, is it just stale for the entire NHL? Maybe that I would agree with a little bit more than it just being stale in Pittsburgh and he could go somewhere else and find success immediately. So I don't think the message is stale, but I will say Sullivan cannot escape repercussions if they continue to keep losing, right? The excuses are flying out the window. There's no excuse for the power play to be as bad as it was this past season. You fired Todd Reirden. You fired the scapegoat. And I'm not saying that Todd Reirden didn't have a big hand in the power play's dysfunctionality last year, but Sullivan had a hand in it too. It was the same exact power play system that Sullivan ran with Phil Kessel back in 2018 and 2017. Things need to change. So if nothing changes, the excuses are kind of washing away. And that puts Mike Sullivan right in the crosshairs if things don't change. He'll likely enter next year with a better team on paper. You would at least hope that he enters next year with a better team on paper. And what I think will be interesting is he should enter next season with a team that is more akin to his style of play, the way that he wants the Penguins to play hockey. Straight line, fast players, create offense, continue to hold possession, and win the game in that facet. Should be getting younger. It's what Kyle Dubas wants. It should look on paper a lot more like the 2016 and 2017 teams than it did the 2022, 2023 teams. It should, simply because that's what it sounds like Kyle Dubas is trying to do. But at the same time, you can't make a carbon copy because the game has changed. Look at the teams that are in the Stanley Cup final. Look at the Florida Panthers specifically. The 2016 Penguins, 2017 Penguins, the style of play, it doesn't match up to today's game as well as you would hope. So I think there needs to be a little bit of a combination. You need to get back to what you were doing in 2016-17, but you need to add guys like Michael Bunting. You only had really one or two of those guys back in those years, and it was Patrick Hornqvist. They need more of those guys. Tyler Bertuzzi is an example. He's on the open market this summer. He might be a little too expensive, but he's on the open market, and he's an example of a type of player that they should be looking for. Max Domi is an example. These aren't guys that are going to go out there and fight Matt Rempe, but at the same time, you saw what Rempe was in the playoffs. Pretty much a non-factor playing 4 minutes a night. That doesn't mean that you don't need to have guys that are willing to go to the dirty areas. That doesn't mean you shouldn't have guys that are willing to take the hits, because these playoffs have been physical. These playoffs have been won in the net front, and that is where the Penguins have been lacking over the last couple of seasons. So if the Penguins and Kyle Dubas are able to give Mike Sullivan that team, a team that is more akin to playing that 2016-17 style, but is able to stand up to the test of the physical style of the most recent playoff and Stanley Cup champions, then it's all on him. It's on him to revive his standing within the fan base. And honestly, while it seems like he's fine within the organization, he probably does have to revive his standing within the organization as well. Because in the back of their mind, whether they admit it or not, they see the same thing that the fan base sees. 6 straight seasons without a playoff series win, back-to-back missed postseasons, and a league that is not as loyal to head coaches as the Penguins have been over the last couple of seasons. He has to get the Pens back on track. It doesn't all fall on him, but a lot of the responsibility falls upon his shoulders and Dubas' shoulders. And Dubas is the one that has been signed for 6 more years. I think that it would end up being Sullivan that is the next scapegoat if it comes down to it. But we'll have to wait and see. The speculation is over for this summer. The speculation is over to me until at least 20 games into this season. And that's when we can reopen the discussion of, well, where are the Penguins at and how secure should Mike Sullivan be? Let me know in the comments your opinions. That's going to do it for this episode of Ice-Burgh To Go. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this episode of Ice-Burgh To Go. Remember, you can find us on YouTube at Inside the Penguins or anywhere you get your podcasts from.